Well, Steve, why don't we begin by your telling us a bit about your background in public transportation and something about Nashville MTA.
Sure. Well, I've been in the mass transit industry for 30-plus years. I'm one of those odd ducks who got into it right out of college and stayed in it, no diversions to other industries, so I love it that much. Been CEO at 4 different transit agencies, ranging from pretty small, about an 80-bus system, up to a 1,000-bus multimodal system in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Also a CEO in Albany, New York, and now Nashville. And I've been here in Nashville as the CEO for about 3 years now. The Nashville MTA is a mid-size bus system in Nashville, Tennessee. So what's interesting and challenging here now is we are a mid-sized system in a large and growing city that has an increasing recognition that it has mobility challenges and that mass transit likely needs to be a much bigger piece of addressing those mobility challenges. So we have about 275 buses. That includes our door-to-door system. We also have an interesting relationship in that we manage a separate organization, which is the Regional Transportation Authority that covers the 10 counties surrounding Nashville, and the services of the RTA consist of primarily contracted commuter bus service as well as one relatively small commuter rail line, about a 30-mile commuter rail line that runs between Nashville and Lebanon, Tennessee to our east. So mid-sized system, about 35,000 passenger boardings per day, very committed staff, and it's been a real strong history here.
Great. Well, thanks, Steve. I understand that I believe it was last September, the MTA Board adopted a long-range 25-year strategic plan. Would you tell us something about the steps you went through in developing that plan and how you kept the board involved through the process?
Mm-hmm. Sure. Well, the InMotion 25-year plan, I think, was unique in a number of ways here. You know, the plan itself, we went through a lot of the typical things, the metrics and the analytics that these sorts of things typically do. 2 things that were unique. I mentioned that in Nashville we have really the 2 parallel organizations, the Metro Transit Authority that handles urban transit in Nashville and the Regional Transportation Authority. The MTA Board is all appointed, 5-member board appointed by the mayor of Nashville and confirmed by the Metro Council here. The Regional Transportation Authority Board is actually composed of the 28 mayors, city and county mayors in our region, including the mayor of Nashville. And the InMotion plan was unique in that typically the organizations coordinate through management, but they run completely independently. And actually, InMotion was jointly adopted in a joint meeting of the Metro Transit Authority and the Regional Transportation Authority boards. First and foremost, where the board was instrumental, actually both boards were instrumental, was when in my arrival in Nashville and as part of the selection process, they were looking for a commitment to developing a long-range plan. The city and the region had just come off of a failed attempt to do a significant bus rapid transit project. And 2 of the consistent criticisms that came out of that process were, number one, there was a perception that it was an insufficient public engagement process, that enough sectors of the community hadn't been reached out to, hadn't been heard. And number 2, that the specific project, people didn't understand how it fit into a comprehensive system. So both boards were really hungry for those 2 pieces to be backfilled. We took a specific approach in InMotion. As I say, the analytics and the technical stuff we did was pretty consistent with what most other transit agencies do from time to time. What was unique was a very specific focus on outreach. And frankly, a significant chunk of our financial commitment to the process was in the outreach, and not just doing kind of a typical planning firm public outreach, but everything from social media to partnering with dozens of neighborhood, community, and regional organizations, outside sponsorships of events, really connecting in a multilingual fashion, in a multicultural fashion, to as many audiences as we possibly could. We did have a number of what I'll call the big meetings where you might get 200 people to a session and do presentations and exchanges, But a lot more of our input was done at neighborhood festivals, where we would have, we had a rap bus that had the theme of the planning process with drop-by stations. And we wanted to make sure it was a two-way dialogue. So during the course of the process, because what I'll call higher-level mass transit, things like light rail, commuter rail, are relatively unfamiliar to people in this area. We issued a number of strategy papers and kind of colorful graphics about what these different elements were and had that conversation. So ultimately, we had about 20,000 public engagements, and we defined an engagement as everything from talking to someone at a public meeting to an engagement in social media, you name it. And we were able to come up with some very consistent themes of what people were interested and wanted to see in their system. And I think that was instrumental in getting the plan approved so universally and widespread support of the plan, everything from media support to business community support to the ecumenical community, you name it. There was a broad level of support for adoption of the plan.
Great. Now, you've also innovated on the budget front. If I recall correctly, you sent a four-tiered three-year budget proposal to the mayor of the city, county, metro government for the year that began July 1, 2017. Tell us about that document.
Sure.
How it was structured,
well, first of all,
what did you intended to achieve?
Sure. Well, we've been very fortunate here at the Metro Transit Authority in Nashville in that we are now on our third in a succession of mayors dating back probably 13, 14 years who are very supportive of mass transit. So we've generally had very good budget support, psychological support, for lack of a better word, of expanding and improving the system. I think a frustration that the board had expressed was typically, hey, we're supposed to be guiding the development and the governance of the transit system, but typically in the budget process, the mayor will tell us what to do, and we just do it. So one of the spin-offs of the in-motion plan, because that had been so thoroughly developed with heavy board involvement and heavy board touches and engagement and direction setting all along, was we kind of had that roadmap of, in sequence, as funding becomes available, these are the types of things we would like to do. So this past budget cycle with Metro Nashville government, the board took a much more active role through a series of workshops during our regular planning committee meetings to identify priorities and specific initiatives that fell into different, we referred to them as buckets, under the in-motion plan. So when we submitted that budget proposal, both for operating and capital, we were able to do a multi-year sequence that said, well, obviously we want to be supportive of any initiative that the mayor decides to pursue, but these are the things that we think will provide the highest leverage or the best bang for the buck. And largely, I'm not going to say that there wasn't an individual initiative or two that weren't high on her list, that weren't necessarily as high on our list that we were funded for, but largely speaking, those recommendations were followed both in the mayor's office development of a proposed budget and also in our Metro Council's consideration and ultimate adoption of that budget. So I think to a person, the MTA board felt as if they were much more engaged in developing the actual new priorities of the organization as opposed to just focusing on the monitoring of existing operations.
Would you tell us a bit more about the four tiers?
Sure.
For your budget?
So our in-motion plan, one of the things, what tends to garner the most attention in these things are what I would call the big wow types of projects, recommendations for light rail or high-level bus rapid transit, so those very expensive, very long-term projects. But the in-motion plan actually lists dozens of improvements, everything from enhancing our real-time information systems to simplifying our route network, you name it, along a whole bunch of fronts. So the buckets that the board identified, frankly, which came off the in-motion process, but with their own, what I'll call flavoring to the process, one of those buckets was, one member characterized it as keep on keeping on. We have a core system that works well, but that we need to maintain and enhance. So one of those buckets was, well, what would we do in terms of maintenance enhancements or safety enhancements to, improve the operation of the current system? Another was the end motion recommendations of what I'll call short-term service improvements, things that had ranked very highly, that are relatively low dollar, could be accomplished in a short period of time, say within a fiscal year, where you would see a visible improvement in service. A third bucket were the things that might take more than a fiscal year to actually realize. Maybe there was a requirement to invest some capital up front, do some construction, acquire additional fleet, what have you, but you were still in a 2 to 4 year time frame. And then the fourth bucket were the activities supporting the development of a longer-term, high-capacity transit network. So I think, Doug, what was most effective about that process was, first of all, we were able to break up a fairly complex plan into chewable chunks, that whether it was individual board meetings or in conversations with the finance department, with the city, or in our budget hearings in front of council, people could have a clearer understanding in a very complex long-term plan where different pieces fit. And then the other was, frankly, it helped in terms of presentation of the budget for the general public to see more, where those resources were being directed.
So these buckets or tiers were different levels of both outcomes and investment, in a sense.
Correct. Right, and also measures of outcome. Obviously the expectation was we would be measuring results and outcomes in a much different way for shorter-term initiatives. So we could measure things like ridership or service productivity or service reach, on the initiatives that were going to be implemented within a fiscal year, compared to long-term corridor development that might take quite a number of years to actually bear fruit, but would have interim milestones along the way, for us to measure. So even the measurement strategies were kind of stratified depending on the tier that a particular initiative was in.
So what's been the payoff on this new budget process for MTA?
Well, I always say the proof of the pudding is in the eating, and I'd love to say that, it was this new process that bore that fruit. Obviously, mass transit and mobility is a high priority of this city and this region right now, and certainly a high priority of this mayor. So we knew going in we were in relatively fertile ground as long as we organized our ask right and put in the high leverage pieces. At the end of the day, what was ultimately recommended and adopted by the Metro Council for this year, for this fiscal year, amounted to a 17% increase in operating assistance. Whoa. And an 80% increase in our capital budget. So, and just to put that in perspective, previously, Metro, in the prior fiscal year, Metro Nashville provided about $42 million to our operating budget, and now they are just under $50 million. They are our single largest source of funding, so any federal participation, state participation, and even operating revenue falls well below that level. Capital was noteworthy in that there had been a significant commitment from them in the prior year, so their commitment of $20 million went up to about $37 million.
Well, so clearly productive and worth the effort.
Yeah. Well, and again, I'll come back to it, and you and I have had this conversation a number of times. I think a long-term payoff of the revision of the process is, number one, having a more engaged board of directors who really felt as though, and in reality, had a heavy touch on that process, rather than just being informed of, okay, here are the initiatives we're going to pursue in next year's budget, and not really having a response to that. That was evident in the level of engagement of really all of our members. I mean, there were no shrinking violets in this process, believe me, through the course of those 2 or 3 workshops that we had in developing the ask. And number two, I think that the accountability structures are much more beefed up when we go for future processes, next year, the year after that, the year after that. Hey, here's what we said we would be able to deliver, and here are the results that we've been able to achieve. In Nashville, that will become critically important next year, and I think we've laid a tremendous groundwork for it, in that our mayor has indicated her intent to pursue a public referendum and a ballot initiative next spring to significantly expand the pool of resources available to mass transit.
Well, Steve, thanks a lot for bringing us up to date on the innovative work you've been doing on the strategic planning and budgeting front at MTA, and I want to wish you a great weekend. Take care.
Thanks, Doug. Appreciate it.